Welcome to Storybounders. I'm Jayme.
And I'm Steve.
Here at Storybounders, we love to read stories, share stories, experience stories, watch stories, listen to stories. We're pretty much all about a good story.
Yeah, we're a little bit obsessed. Stories are like magic, and we're on a mission to uncover those stories that inspire and move us, that light up our imaginations, that bring us closer together, and that fill us with hope.
And today, we've got a great story for you. Welcome to our second episode. It's that time of year when we celebrate our independence and freedom, and as a major history buff, especially American history, I really geek out about the whole thing. I am a patriot through and through. And even with all its faults, I love my country dearly. I think it's a beautiful thing, the birth of America. So I'm excited to share a story that celebrates our American heritage, but also celebrates friendship. Friendship is wonderfully fulfilling and desirable, but it can be a tricky business, especially when it's between two people who are quite different from one another. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson shared an unusual and monumental time in history, as well as the distinguished title of Founding Father. They also shared a fervent love of independence, freedom, and the pursuit of happiness. But they really could not have been more different in upbringing, culture, temperament, and social standing. John Adams was a product of New England culture, pious, frugal, industrious, punctual, and inclined to follow rules and meet expectations, while Thomas Jefferson was a proud Virginian, genteel, passionate, a visionary, and a dreamer. He did manage to keep both feet on the ground, mostly. John Adams was short, rotund, and boy, did he hate that word. Red-faced and outspoken, and sometimes almost abrasive and offensive. He was a realist. Thomas Jefferson was red-haired, tall, handsome, dignified, reserved, and well-liked. He was an idealist. So you can see how this is going, right? Well, they both met as delegates to the Continental Congress in April of 1775. Thomas Jefferson was charged with drafting the Declaration of Independence, and John Adams was on the committee to make revisions. And at first meeting, there was genuine liking and friendship. They were, after all, bonded over the same cause. Now, at this time, Adams was more famous because of his successful law practice, and he had a role in the Boston Massacre court proceedings. But Jefferson would soon outpace him in popularity and legacy. Jefferson's opinion and approval would be sought long after his presidency had ended, while Adams was cast into increasing obscurity as the years passed. This caused a lot of jealousy for Adams. He was very disappointed, and it really, really bothered him. So Jefferson joined Adams in diplomatic service in France in the summer of 1784. The Revolutionary War had just ended, and now they were engaged in peace talks. While they were there, Jefferson met Abigail Adams for the first time, and they developed a beautiful friendship. And Jefferson took to the French way of life like a fish to water, while Adams was more like oil. Jefferson was absolutely enamored with the decorum and etiquette of the dignitaries in Europe. They weren't easily ruffled and always maintained politeness and civility. He also fell in love with their art and their music, their literature, and their scientific progress, which he wished to bring back home and integrate into the rough and ready American culture. Adams, on the other hand, became increasingly alienated as he rubbed pretty much everything and everyone the wrong way. He was just too unbending and rigid, too much of a social hazard to be a diplomat. However, it was during this time that Jefferson and Adams' friendship really blossomed. They shared a love of culture, art, and books. When Adams moved to London for a 5-year stay, Jefferson would come visit, and they would take garden tours and have long talks. And they just genuinely enjoyed each other's company. It was here that their friendship was forged into something real and lasting. Adams did seem to be a little more principled and grounded overall when it came to home life. He and Abigail were very careful with their finances and resources, while Jefferson practically ran himself into the ground, buying beautiful books and furniture to be shipped back to the States. Adams was always very loyal to his wife and family, while Jefferson had an alleged affair with a married woman while in France. And Adams was saddened by his friend's unprincipled decisions, but it didn't change their relationship. And after returning to the States, they both had their eye on the presidency as George Washington prepared to leave office. Adams managed to win the campaign for presidency, and he served his 4 years with Jefferson as vice president. Now, he fully expected to be reelected for a second term, just like Washington had. But the campaign turned unbelievably ugly. His opponent, his own friend and ally, Jefferson, was running a smear campaign in the local newspapers. It was incredibly insulting and humiliating. It must have felt brutal. Adams tried to fight back, but he just didn't have much stomach for it. The humiliation was compounded when Adams lost the presidency to Jefferson, and he left the White House feeling very betrayed and defeated. Their friendship was pretty much ruined. It was in absolute ashes. Some believed it was beyond repair. So, what had happened? Adams and Jefferson's approach to government and politics were polar opposites. They did not agree on practically anything. They were on opposite ends of a great divide, and they struggled to find compromise on their ideals. And not only were they necessarily lumped into the ongoing conflict between the northern and the southern states, but they just had very different viewpoints on the nature of humanity and the future of the country. Jefferson was a radical liberal of the day. Now, not the kind of liberal that you're probably thinking of, but a liberal who believed in a very limited government. He firmly believed that humans are innately born as freedom-loving, and if left to their own devices without meddling governmental forces, men would just easily and more efficiently govern themselves. He believed that education was the key to creating an aristocratic society where everyone's genteel ways would govern the common good. He believed in nurture versus nature. He was just freedom-loving almost to an extreme. Now, Adams was a conservative of the day, but again, not the kind of conservative you're thinking of. Adams believed that America did not have some kind of special sauce that made them incorruptible. No amount of education could save them from the evil, the corruption, and the greed that existed in pretty much every nation and culture. A body of people must have a firm government and checks and balances in place to stand as a constant vigil against power and corruption. Now, while Jefferson believed every man was equal, not everyone was technically included in that. And Adams understood that everyone is born under different circumstances, economically and otherwise. Like, some kids are born pretty, while others are born not so pretty. Some are born into money, while others are born into poverty. Some kids are smart, others are not so smart. Now, I'm being kind here, but Adams would have given it to you straight. So he believed in equal rights, but he didn't believe that everyone would have the ability to reach aristocratic status. Maybe his own friendship with the affable Jefferson brought that point a little too close to home. But, I mean, could these two men really be any more different? The only thing they could agree on was their hatred of Alexander Hamilton. So maybe it's best if they just part ways, right? I mean, why even try? Well, fortunately, they had a mutual friend who just couldn't stand to see their broken friendship. Dr. Benjamin Rush, who was also a signer of the Declaration of Independence, worked really hard to get the two to make amends. But he had to tread lightly. He was working with two pretty high-maintenance characters. He made some subtle inquiries into whether or not he could suggest a truce, and he found that they both still had some fondness for each other. So it was 1812 when Dr. Rush managed to convince Adams to start writing a letter to Jefferson. Jefferson had the politeness and the manners to respond. It was a little bit lukewarm at first, but over the next 14 years, Jefferson and Adams wrote more than 150 letters across hundreds of miles. There was much teasing and pushing of buttons, but it was all taken good-naturedly. And eventually, they kind of just avoided talking politics, and they just kept things light and humorous, but they did share a great affection for one another. On one occasion, Jefferson wrote to Adams, "A letter from you calls up recollections very dear to my mind. It carries me back to the times when, beset with difficulties and dangers, we were fellow laborers in the same cause, struggling for what is most valuable to man, his right of self-government, laboring always at the same oar, with some wave ever ahead threatening to overwhelm us, and yet passing harmless under our bark. We knew not how. We rode through the storm with heart in hand and made a happy port." Jefferson continued to receive attention and accolades while Adams faded into the shadows. This really bothered Adams greatly, but he never lost love for his beloved Jefferson. They both began to age and retired from public life. They focused on their family and home life and their ever-growing posterity. Adams experienced much heartache with the loss of children, and Jefferson faced financial problems. The 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence was approaching, and both of them received invitations to attend the Jubilee celebration, but they both had to decline due to ill health. On the morning of July 4th, 1826, Jefferson laid bedridden in his home in Monticello. He took his last breath at noon and slipped away into eternity. Hundreds of miles away in Quincy, Massachusetts, Adams also lay bedridden, unaware that his dear friend had just died. Hours later, as he was taking his last breath, he uttered the words, "Jefferson still lives." What a remarkable moment in history. What a way to mark the lives of two incredible fathers of a nation and two dear friends. I try very hard not to make too much of these kinds of stories because I inevitably get labeled as gullible and crazy. But it's my personal belief that this event was not coincidence at all. It was a gentle reminder from God, a reminder of what people sacrificed for us to have our freedoms and prosperity today, but also of what is possible. Jefferson and Adams are a tremendous example of building bridges and crossing them to create peace and harmony. Somehow they did it. Two opposing forces coming together in unity and love. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson could easily represent the two factions of our country right now. We are on the outs, just like Adams and Jefferson were at one point. We've blamed, we've pointed fingers, and we've humiliated each other, and now it seems as though it's irreparable. And we need to find a way to make it right again, to find respect and dignity and some common ground. I know this sounds super silly, but maybe we need a friend like Dr. Rush who encourages us to start writing letters to one another. Could we start a dialogue? Could we have the politeness and the gentility of Jefferson to answer? Could we have the fervor of Adams who writes profusely because we're just so excited to be talking? Adams wrote double the letters that Jefferson wrote, but Jefferson was always a perfect gentleman when Adams decided to poke and tease. Altogether, these gentlemen wrote 380 letters back and forth throughout their lifetime, nurturing and forging a bond that lasted beyond death. Now, if you're familiar with Christian teachings, then you will know the scripture in the book of Matthew, where Jesus Christ says, "Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them which despitefully use you and persecute you." I have always stumbled with this scripture. Love your enemies? Really? Bless them that curse you? I mean, really? How about justice? Like, where's the justice? I've always had trouble seeing the practical application of this scripture. But it occurred to me while writing this episode that Jefferson and Adams are living examples of this very idea. They had so much going against them. Their personality differences, cultural differences, their opposing views on philosophy, religion, politics, and government. And then the presidential campaign, where both of them engaged in very damaging, sometimes ruthless tactics to win the White House. They had become what we call in the modern age frenemies. But when tempers diffused and time had passed, they were humble enough to seek forgiveness and healing. They weren't content to remain enemies, for life was so much better, so much richer and fuller when they blessed each other's lives with friendship.
Well done again. That was great, Jayme. I really liked how you brought all that together with Adams and Jefferson and tied it to, this idea that we can communicate with each other. I really do think that that's an important non-coincidental thing, that these two founding fathers were so dynamic and so opposite, but learned. I mean, they were responsible for some of the, bitter politics that we see today between the two parties and trying to get for the presidency. But they also were responsible for showing how we could eventually overcome that if we had enough humility and were willing to, talk to one another, which I think is a super important point. And I'm pretty sure it's frenemies and not friendemies, but that's okay. I was thinking a little bit, I liked too what you brought out about Benjamin Rush, right? And because as I think about their stories and this idea, the thing that you related, Benjamin Rush seems to me a good model for a lot of us, right? We don't have to be the Adams or the Jefferson and be so dynamic, but we can be the person that heals divides and builds bridges between people by encouraging them to listen to each other. In our last episode, we talked about listening to each other's stories and the fact that we need each other's stories and that we are the sum of our stories. We've got to share those with each other to really have understanding. And that's really what Benjamin Rush did in his small way, right? In this story, he has a small part, but he played a really important role in getting these two men to talk to each other, to understand each other, to forgive each other, and to move forward. And we can do that. We can do that with people that we know, or, we can be the Benjamin Rush. And Benjamin Rush did so many great things beyond that. He's worth his own, podcast and stories someday. But in this particular instance, he was wise enough to help these people, his friends, heal each other, which I think is just awesome. I think it's, the way Adams wrote it, where he said to Jefferson, at the encouragement of Benjamin Rush, he wrote to him and he said, you and I ought not to die before we have explained ourselves to each other, which is another way of saying we need to listen to each other's stories because it's worth the effort to do that, which I think is just a beautiful thing.
Absolutely, because it brings about an understanding. And I think they got there. I think through each letter, they were able to really start to understand one another and where they were coming from and why they thought the way they did. There were reasons why they thought so differently. They came from different places. So it's good to remember that when we're interacting with other people, And I also think about how there's just lots of layers to this story, because you think about Dr. Rush, and he managed to be friends with both of these people as well, right? He was friends with two people who were very, very different, because sometimes we tend to surround ourselves with friends who are very like-minded, right? They think like we do. And this is just a good example of, obviously, he was surrounding himself with people who thought very differently about things. And he cared very deeply for both of these people who were very different. So I think that's a great example.
Yeah. Well, I got to thinking about, why were they different? And we have a daughter who will really appreciate what I'm about to say. Because I went ahead and I did some research to see what were the personality types of Adams and Jefferson, right? If you had to break it down into the Myers-Briggs model or, one of those models about, what was causing the conflict. And it's really interesting because, at least according to some of the professional psychologists that bothered to try to figure out their personalities, and it comes with a disclaimer. They're all like, well, without being able to interview Adams and Jefferson, we can't really give them a personality type. Yeah. But based on their letters and all of this, we're going to make a guess. And so Adams is an INTJ, which, if you're not familiar with Myers-Briggs, that stands for being somewhat of an introvert, somebody who's very intuitive, the T stands for thinking and the J stands for having good judgment, right? So he was intuitive, introverted, had good judgment, but he was more of a thinker. Whereas Jefferson is an INFJ, which is all the same qualities, but the F stands for feeling rather than thinking.
I see where you're going.
Right. So to me, it's like, well, that's obviously what was like giving them these that's why they were butting heads so much, right? Because thinker people, analytical people tend to just be like, hey man, facts and figures, and it is what it is, we just got to deal with it. And the feeling people are more, optimistic and sometimes artistic, and it's like, hey, sky's the limit, we can, as long as it feels good, we can make it happen.
Mm-hmm.
I may not have all the answers, but it's gonna, and as you were telling your story, I'm like, oh yeah, I can see that, I can see why thinking and feeling became kind of a thing for those two, and why it would be hard to get over that. And honestly, in our politics today, I think that's a very similar issue, right? Because it's, the parties get a little crazy with their, accusations of each other. And I think that's one of the things that's wrong today is, we're just so busy trying to like vilify the other people, right? Like, oh, if you're not with me, you're with them and they're like evil or wrong, or, but the reality is, most people aren't evil or wrong. They just have kind of different points of view on what we're trying to do. And it's like, well, everybody wants to take care of children. Everybody wants to take care of the elderly. Everybody wants to take care of veterans. The question is, how do we do that? And what's the right way to do that? And this is essentially where Adams and Jefferson had all their disagreements. They were in total agreement about needing a new country and a constitution and preserving freedoms. It was just Adams, was maybe a little more analytical and pessimistic. And so he's like, hey, we have to have these checks and balances to make sure things don't, run away and get out of control. And Jefferson was saying, yes, but at the same time, we need to make sure those controls don't impede human ingenuity and creativity. We want a place where everybody can really, the American dream idea, right? Everybody can flourish if they'll choose to. We need to make sure they're not too restricted. And of course, life is a balance. We're back to the Goldilocks zone, right? You yes. need both of those things in order to have a society that can function. There has to be plenty of liberty and freedom and opportunity, but there also has to be responsibility and accountability, and all of that matters, or else one of those extremes is just gonna unravel, and you're not gonna really have a country that can work.
Yeah. Well, and I wonder, obviously this whole like Goldilocks zone thing is kind of a modern way of thinking of it, right? Yeah. But obviously, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, they managed to find that Goldilocks zone without even really knowing what it was. Like they figured out how to like really see each other for who they really were, and they were able to like basically find common ground. I think that's really cool. I've been thinking a lot about this because I spend some time on social media, mostly because I kind of have to for business, but I'm on there and I can see people just feeling very divided, feeling very fearful, feeling very angry, feeling defensive. And I think this might be a really good thing for us to think about, especially as a country, and especially as we're heading into another, heavy political year. Just thinking about how can we do this? Like, how can we basically be like Adams and Jefferson, and come together and see each other's perspectives.
Yeah, and it's I really liked how you started by preemptively letting everybody know that you're an idealist and you're a bit of a dreamer and a bit of an optimist. You're if people can't tell from the conversation, they will be by the end of more episodes. Like I'm more of the INTJ and you're more of the INFJ kind of person.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's interesting because we have conversations like this where I'm usually the one that's like, I don't know. It's too risky. Maybe we shouldn't do that. And you're like, no, it'll be great. We'll go for it. Starting this podcast included. Right.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting to see that those two ideas are really important. I think the other thing that matters here is, we should never let people dismiss idealism. Idealism is really important, because it's the idea of hope and optimism, right? And you've done a good job of like instilling that with our kids. And all of our kids are kind of the same ilk. We get together and talk as a family. If we look at, politics or society, as a group, everyone's like, oh, guys, can't we just get along? Like everybody's pretty great. Everyone has something to offer, like we can come together and do this. But of course, it's hard. It's especially when things get really tense and really important and you feel like you have to make kind of life or death decisions, when you're talking about, I don't know, immigration or policies that affect children and families and poverty. It's, it's hard to say, oh, well, to each his own, if you think that the other side of that is going to really lead to harm for somebody, so your passions can get really worked up. And that's sort of what happened to Jefferson and Adams. I mean, it's like, it was hard for them to always be, rational enough and calm enough in their heart to just say, oh, we can respect each other and let's work through it with the dialogue, because it really mattered, the things they were talking about. And it matters the things we're talking about today. But I think it's important to remember that these are ideals, and all of us we kind of understand the ideal, and we're all going to fall short. We're all going to like say things we shouldn't say to each other. We're all, and this is why the idea of the Christian teachings of like forgiveness and empathy and understanding and, patience and humility. That's why these are so important, because you need all those things if you want to genuinely hear someone else's story and to connect with them. Otherwise,
Absolutely.
you really can't do it.
Yeah. So I was thinking, I do tend to be more of the emotional side of our relationship, right? I'm more of the dreamer and the visionary, but what's nice is that you compliment me, and that's kind of what we're talking about here is finding that balance, right?
Right.
You ground me, and sometimes you're able to help me see, like you help me see that I need to be a little more real about things, but you're very careful about not destroying my dream. Does that make sense? So like allowing me to dream, but also helping me reel back a little bit sometimes, and doing something that's maybe a little more practical.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking, so a lot of us feel very passionate about what's happening in our country. We feel very passionate about, who's going to occupy the White House for the next 4 years. And I guess it comes back to using that story reservoir, right? Using those stories that we've collected that have helped us build some character, have helped us build perspective, using that to basically pull us back from being too passionate. It's okay to be passionate, but pulling us back from being too passionate and being a little more grounded and a little more, I guess, even-minded, and being able to at least calm down enough to see, somebody else's side to things, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And and the opposite is true, right? It's, I can come to things and be very, like, hey, I'm really afraid of this direction or trying this thing, or, I'm just so worried about the things that can go wrong. And I have good reasons. Here's my facts and my data and my research about, this can be terrible. And I need somebody who is like, well, that might be true, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't try. And here's some reasons to have hope and optimism. And it might be better than you think. And let's do that, and you provide a lot of that for me by, kind of helping me not be afraid and use my pragmatism to say, okay, well, some of those things, so you're ready for it. So let's try it anyway, because you'll be ready if something happens, and that's kind of, I think, the balance that Jefferson and Adams have. I also think this is maybe turning into the Valentine's Day episode between you and me and everybody who's listening. So we'll come back to Jefferson and Adams.
What I find funny is that our own relationship is kind of like another example, because we're, we can be quite different sometimes, but I'm sure a lot of people feel that way. There's a lot of relationships or just things that need to be balanced out. It just makes it better. It's so much better when it's balanced out. So that's what made their friendship work. Like I said, sometimes we tend to find friends that are like-minded, and that makes the relationship a little bit easier. Doesn't make it perfect, but it is easier. But, sometimes we have relationships with people who, can almost be complete opposites of us, but it can still work. That's the point, is we can still find friendship, right?
I agree. I mean, in my work career, I've had a lot of different colleagues that, this has played out, it's like, well, I'll be working with somebody who I'm like, man, you are just coming at this from a completely different point of view. And sometimes it's frustrating, because I'm like, no, I've thought of that and we should go this way. And, but some of my best work colleagues and work friends over the years from the different places I've worked came from this idea that we both kind of, we'd go to lunch or something and we'd sort of talk, and we were both willing to listen and to really be able to say, okay, I think I really get where you're coming from. And actually, that makes sense the way you talk about it. But here's my idea. And this is what I'm thinking. And they could say, oh, yeah, I can really see that. And that actually makes sense the way you're thinking about it. And I often come away from those conversations, with this idea of, I'm still maybe pretty convicted about the general idea, but I have new appreciation and understanding and a better way of approaching these problems that always leads to better solutions and better ways forward, because I have that, that balance of point of view.
Yeah.
And coming back to this idea of specifically about thinking and feeling, it's like the brain versus the heart, right? People can find this in lots of different kinds of religion. And in Christianity, this is how it plays out. It's the idea that both matter, right? Jesus Christ would often teach that we could sense the truth of things both with our mind and with our heart, right? Like we'll know in our mind and our heart the thing that we should do, that like the spirit that we feel comes to both of those things, not just one or the other. And they do need to be balanced. And if we lean a little one way or the other, that's okay. And if we recognize, especially if we have a spouse that leans kind of the opposite way and we're willing to talk, like we can get at the whole truth by respecting those things. And that's kind of what, I think Adams and Jefferson did when it came to America, right? If you think about it, the concerns that Adams had led to this very real and very good thing of checks and balances. But Jefferson was able to take that and to give it some words and to really give it life, right? So if Adam gave us structure and stability, Jefferson gave us, creativity and passion for these American ideals and for the Constitution, which is what they hoped and what we should hope as Americans. One of the authors I researched, his name is Gordon Wood, and he wrote this book called Friends Divided, and it was about Jefferson and Adams. But he made a point in one of the articles I read that he said, to be an American is not to be someone, but to believe in something.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah, I did too. I thought it was really powerful. And it goes along with the idea of what I think Harold Goddard was saying about the idea of the destiny of the world is determined less by the battles that are lost and won than by the stories we love and believe in. Those are really similar ideas, and they mean the same thing, that it's like, yeah, we are believing in ideals. We fall short of ideals. We need structure and rules to kind of help us when we fall short. But ultimately, if we can all agree to believe in that and to pursue it together, it can be an amazing, wonderful thing. And that's like, I love that America doesn't have this, like, it's not a certain ethnicity or race or history. Like we didn't come from a certain line of kings or a certain whatever, there wasn't, it's not that necessarily. It's like actually anyone who wants to believe these ideas should be welcome and should be included. And we can do it together. We can bring all of our ideas and our cultures and our experiences together. But if we're united on this idea of everyone deserves respect and liberty and freedom and help when they need it, and we can do that in appropriate ways, then I think America can be the kind of ideal place that the founding fathers hoped it would.
I love that. And I actually have something that I want to share from Gordon Wood.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. So it's actually from that very same book, Friends Divided, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. He said that although America needed Adams' blunt honesty about the truths of America's situation, what we needed more were the ideas of Jefferson that nourish the diverse peoples coming to America over the next 200 years. These people who had not descended from the founding fathers needed us to find a place in this melting pot of a country. And the ideals set forth in the Declaration of Independence, specifically that all men are created equal, has been the glue that holds us all together. Everyone feels that they have a place at the table, and that creates peace and unity. Abraham Lincoln paid homage to Jefferson for his foresight and said, that old Declaration of Independence with its expression of the moral principle of equality to draw upon. This moral principle, which was applicable to all men and all times, made all these different peoples one with the founders, as though they were blood of the blood and flesh of the flesh of the men who wrote that declaration. But also, both Adams and Jefferson contributed to the Constitution, which has functioned as the ultimate glue for the diverse peoples of America. A couple of Yale scholars commented, "For all its flaws, the United States is uniquely equipped to unite a diverse and divided society. Its citizens don't have to choose between a national identity and multiculturalism. Americans can have both. But the key is constitutional patriotism. We have to remain united by and through the Constitution, regardless of our ideological disagreements. Okay, so I actually don't really like pitting Jefferson against Adams and vice versa. I don't like trying to
Right.
decide who was the better founding father. And in fact, I can hear my mother in my ear right now telling me what an awesome man Adams was and coming to his defense. And she is like one of his biggest champions. But the thing is, I don't disagree. I have to say that I absolutely love both of these men, as different as they are. And I've read very detailed biographies on Adams and Jefferson, and I found myself relating to both of them because I think they represent two sides of my own personality very well.
Yeah.
Because I waffle from being very pragmatic and very practical to being very passionate and idealistic and visionary, you know? So I feel like I really get both of these men like a lot.
Right. Well, it's interesting. I mean, I agree with that. I don't think there's much sense in choosing a favorite. I laughed a little bit when you read the part about the only thing they agreed on was they hated Hamilton. You know? Which is like,
well, they did.
And, and Hamilton's pretty great. I mean,
Yeah.
I know a lot of people don't love the musical. I thought it was really good.
Oh,
but
I thought
also
it was
his
great.
story. Yeah, and his story is really good. What Hamilton's trying to do, and it's remember we talked a little bit in the last episode about there's two sides to every story. Well, in the Founding Fathers case, there really are 20, 30, 40 sides to this story, and they're all important, and it's worth considering because it helps us understand kind of the checks and balances in our own heart about how we live this American ideal. And I think that that's like a really important part of our citizenship, an important part of who we are, as Americans. It's interesting. I read an article from Dennis C. Rasmussen, who he's a historian that works for the John Adams Foundation or their society. And he wrote a little bit about, at the end of their lives, what were the things the founding fathers were worried about, right? And he talks about several founding fathers, but I picked out the ones where he talked about Washington, Adams, and Jefferson. And the point of the article was they were so excited about the founding. They really, worked hard to do something they thought was important with the Constitution. But toward the end of their lives, they were worried, is this sustainable? Is it stable? Will it make it? And of course, Washington's biggest concern was the party system, and I know a lot of people, if you've read much about history at all or get into that, that was Washington's concern. He was just like, he was seeing it with Adams and Jefferson. He's like, oh man, this partisan politics can do a lot of damage. And Washington's certainly right about that, which is why it's so important that I wish the parties would progress in the same way Adams and Jefferson has, and being a lot more united and civil and kind with each other and listen to each other and try to get down there. And some politicians do, to be fair. It's just generally the parties, are known for being polar opposites and kind of antagonistic. And of course, Adams' worry was that people wouldn't have enough civic virtue, that they wouldn't be educated and informed and that just it wouldn't work because they didn't understand. They wouldn't take the time to understand their role as a citizen, as a constitutional citizen. And Jefferson's big concern was what's called sectionalism, right? The idea that the people in New York and California don't care about the flyover states, so-called, right? Or that the people in the South versus the North, in his day, the issue of, slavery and emancipation. But in modern times, you can see the same thing, right? You've got different parts of the country that can get kind of really riled up and antagonize one another. And all of these things miss the point that if it's not inclusive, if it's not a place where we can be united by ideals and kind of put down some of these other differences, and if we're not willing to be informed about the process and about each other, then it does kind of break down, and I just think that's an important thing for us to remember as we try to move forward.
Absolutely. And I think I've been hearing a lot lately about how one side feels like the other is about ready to destroy the Constitution. And what's so funny about that is the other side feels exactly the same way.
Yes. Yeah.
So both sides are feeling like the other side is about ready to kill the country.
Right.
And if we step back for a second and look at that and realize, hey, we're all talking about the Constitution. We're all worried about that. We're all trying to stand by it. Then maybe that might kind of change our minds about some things.
Yes.
Maybe
yeah.
not get so angry,
Yeah. Well, and interestingly, both Adams and Jefferson kind of offered a prescription, right? In for what could solve this, right? If we're worried about overcoming this, if we're trying to heal, the country and one another. For both men, it really came down to the things that we learn. It came down to the stories that we love and believe in, right? So Adams said, this is a quote, right? Liberty cannot be preserved without general knowledge among the people. So there, again, this is Adams, very factual, very to the point. Like, we need to be informed. In other words, we need to learn and read and know the stories behind the Constitution and the founding and all of this, and also one another. And Jefferson put it much more eloquently, because he's more the feeler, the artist. He said, I cannot live without books. And by implication, none of us can live without books, without the stories that help us understand who we are, how we relate to another, and how stories that will inspire us to overcome these differences and to, take a stand in a empathetic, kind, meaningful, loving way to say, hey guys, I think everybody has some good ideas here. Let's calm down, be patient, and find a way forward that is as kind and good and inclusive as it can be, while still, preserving liberty and law and responsibility and all the things that we need to make our society work. There will be a way forward if we can be patient and humble enough to listen to each other's stories and find it.
Absolutely. I love that. And I love that the thought that we're all at the same table. And if we're just reminded of that we're all, we're all at the same table, and there's a place for all of us here. And I love the idea of finding those stories that help you better understand who we are, American heritage, who we are, where we came from, why we do the things we do. Like, why does our government run the way it does? Like, I would just encourage everyone, go find those stories, especially if you feel like maybe you don't know about enough about that, or you want to learn more about it. And that's true for us too. There's definitely more stories that we need to find on our end as well. So anyways, just to wrap up our story about Thomas Jefferson and John Adams and their beautiful friendship, I just wanted to say they both had strengths. They both had weaknesses. They both gave everything they had to ensure that our country gave us what history has denied to so many people for so long. And what they did may not have been perfect, but it truly was extraordinary. I believe it was a miracle, and I will always be grateful and in debt to them for their service. And just as a fun little note, and just something for you to chew on this week, James Madison, who, correct me if I'm wrong, was he our fourth president?
I think fourth or fifth. I think fourth, yes.
Okay, so James Madison, who was our fourth president, also died on July 4th. And this was 5 years after the deaths of Adams and Jefferson in 1831. But it was on basically Independence Day. So maybe you can discuss the significance, or if you maybe the insignificance, I don't know, of that event over your 4th of July barbecue party. We wish America a happy birthday and happy holiday to all of you. Thanks to colonialwilliamsburg.org, Monticello.org, and constitutioncenter.org for being such great resources, as well as Gordon S. Wood. And we'll see you next week with another great story. Goodbye.